I was born in San Francisco, California, and moved here when I was approximately 4 months old. My parents were Richard and Olivia Roso. My dad, Richard, he had a brother and 2 sisters, and of course my Uncle Joseph was my uncle, and he was a farmer and had been a farmer all his life. My mom was one of 7 sisters, and I think she had 3 brothers, and she had 2 brothers. My dad's parents, they had both come from Italy. They were like 4 or 5 years old whenever they came here. When the town was actually established in 1998, and that's when they came. When they come up from Sunnyside, they were both born. Probably, I don't know if they were probably born in Sunnyside or Italy, one of the two. I don't know if they come directly from Sunnyside up here or how long they were in Sunnyside before they come up, but they were about 4 years old. So they probably were just babies when they left Italy or something like that. My mom's parents, they did not come with the original settlers. They came just 2 or 3 years later. They come like in, I think in 1902 or something like that, and they were in the second bunch that came up. I had, the siblings that I had I just had one sister. Her name was Nancy, and she was 7 years younger than I was. My dad actually was a farmer to start with. And then later on, he became postmaster of Tontitown. My father was a farmer, and he raised chickens, of course, like everybody else in Tontitown did. And but I want to say whenever I was in, I don't remember, probably just about the time I started high school, is when he became postmaster. She worked some outside the home. She actually waited tables at Mary Mastrie's. She married my mom, and then at the Venetian Inn also. I think she worked also some, and my sister also did at both places also. Well, my part in the family business was I had to just do all the chores and stuff like everybody else. I had to milk cows. I had to feed chickens. And I had to cultivate. I had to run the tractor. I had to disc and stuff and plow and everything like that. Before I left the farm. Of course, when we were kids, we picked beans, we picked strawberries, we picked grape. We did anything whatever was in season. Well, we worked for different, and we helped out the neighbors. Not necessarily, I mean, like, I really didn't enjoy picking beans all that much, but my dad always made me, because the neighbors was the one that had to have the beans picked, and he needed pickers. So my dad would make me go and say, you got to go pick whether you want to or not. So I'd have to go pick beans. They actually paid us. They actually paid us, and when you picked beans, you went out in the bean field, and they had this one bean field that it was almost 15 acres. So the rows were long. You can imagine how long a 15-acre bean field would be. We pick them in a bushel basket, and when you got your basket full, then you had to carry them to where they weighed them. And then they weighed the beans on this, really was no considered cotton scales, I think it was, the old-fashioned cotton scales. And then they paid you right there for what was in that deal. They paid it. And they paid you, and you might not have but 30 cents worth of beans or $1 worth, whatever it was. They paid you, and then you went back to the field. You walked back down, picked another bushel, and brought it back up and did that. My mother took care of the house. My sister was younger than me, so I helped until she got old enough to do some, like, the dishes and stuff like that. When I was younger, I did some of the dish work and stuff like that, but most of the time, I did stuff outside. My mother actually took care of the house. That was her job, because at that time, she did not work out. She was always there to try to get her, to see you know, when wash day come and stuff like that, I had to get stuff ready, had to get water ready and stuff like that, and we did things like that. As a family, the first place I can ever remember of living was just south of Tontitown. Actually, it was this place bordered my granddad's place, on my mother's side. My granddad on my mother's side. I lived in that. It was a 2-story house. I was probably, gosh, I couldn't have been over 4 if I was, but I can still remember that because I can remember falling down the stairs and bleeding my nose. That was one of the main things I can remember about it. And another time I was running, I was out in the yard and somebody's pigs got out and I ran and I was running to get away from them. Not that they were going to eat me up or anything, but it's just I didn't know, you know, that the pigs were out and stuff like that. So I was running in the house. And back then they used to take the scythe and cut all the weeds and stuff in the lots and stuff around there. And those stobs would stick up like that. And when I ran, I run a stob up through the roof of my mouth. I'll remember those. So those are the 2 things I can remember about living there at that one place. Two traumas, but I can remember both. And then we moved from there just a short time later to the whole home place, to my granddad's place, because my dad bought it from my granddad. My granddad, he had gotten older and he just couldn't farm it anymore, so he sold the place to my dad, and then he lived with us for a few years, not many years, before he had cancer and passed away. Earliest memories going into Tontitown was mainly going to church, because we would drive. We did have a car. The first car that I can remember us having was a Model A. And the Model A, we drove the Model A up there, and then later on, and I think my dad bought a 37 Ford, and we had that, that was up to date. That was up from the Model A back then. And we lived both of these places that we lived down there. You have to remember now, there was no electricity, no running water, because you couldn't get. It was on the end of the trail, so you couldn't get. They wouldn't give you electricity. You'd had to pay for the poles, the lines, and everything. They would not do nothing. We never did have it while we was there. And when we moved up to, and from there, I know on my 10th birthday, I lived right here, just where I live now, just the far end of this place down here. It was a 2-story house, and I lived down here, and they did have electricity, and we did have running water in the house and stuff. Well, it is a big deal to have electricity if you've had it before, but if you've never really had it, you really don't miss it until you've had it. Once you've had it, then you're stuck. You have to have it from then on. But at that time, it was just different. You had, instead of going and turning the faucet on to get a drink of water, you just went into the water bucket and just dipped it out and it was like that. And instead of going through and turning the light on, you had the light, either kerosene, some type of kerosene lamp to see by, or back then you used the Aladdin lamp that they used, that used white gas in it, and you pump that up and stuff like that. Those had to look quite a bit like, same as like your lanterns do now, with your wick lanterns that do now. And believe me, it was nice. Don't get me wrong, it was nice to have all this, but you didn't really, and of course, at that age, because, you know, I got it by the time I was about 10, so a little bit before I was 10, so it wasn't that big of a deal. And the thing, most of the people that I knew did not have it either, so that some of them did. Now my grandparents did. On my dad's side, their home was on they're south of Tontitown, and it was on where the electric lines ran right in front of their house, so it was easy for them to get electricity. And these people, they'd give you electricity, but those spurs off to the side and stuff like that, they had to make sure they had enough population out there to make it feasible to run the lines. Is what they did. There was 3 stores in Tontitown. When I grew up, there was actually three grocery stores in Tontitown. And these 3 stores, we traded basically in 2 of them. We traded in the other one because the one store, I'm sure people will tell you about a Mr. Malauer. He ran that one store. He was the greatest man. And if he's not in heaven, nobody is, because this man is just one of the nicest people you ever want to know, and never said no harm to nobody and everything like that. He was really something. But after school, we'd always stop by and go in his grocery store to get a drink of water, because we knew when we gave us a drink of water, he was going to give us a piece of candy. And he gave every time, and we would go through there, and there may be 15 kids walking through that store, because that's how many walked down that road that lived down those roads down there. And we'd go in, and each one, as we walked out, he would be standing there like this, handing out a stick of gum, a piece of candy, and stuff like this. So really didn't need a drink. We knew that when we did that. But this man was, and he was also the organist in the church. And he'd shut his when we had choir practice and stuff, he shut his store down, locked her up for choir practice at 1 o'clock. From 1 to 2 was choir practice. He shut the store down. The other, Richard Ardemangi, was the Ardemangi store, and he ran, at one time it was on the south side of Tontitown, just right across on the main drag. But then when I was about 7 or 8, it seemed like the sign's still on the store up there. I think it might be 51 is when they moved it across and built a new store. And then he had it over, and Richard, he ran that store. Him and his wife ran the store. When he had the old store over, I don't think Richard was married at that time, but he got married later on. And he had that. And then the store down below him was the Mersani store. It was Claude and Emma. That was a couple who ran that store until they were, I guess, from the time they got married. And back then you used to get married around when they were about 25 or something like that. So most people didn't get married before then. And about that time they got married and had the store. And they stayed there till the day they retired. And they didn't have any children. They had never had any children. So that was there, and they stayed open 6.5 days a week. I mean, never take vacation, never nothing. Well, there was always Mary Masters. Mary Masters who is my great aunt. She was she's always had just south of Tontitown. The Mary Masters place was always, and she had in her own home, and she had chicken and spaghetti. She's always had, it was always there, and she did the cooking, and her and another lady, her next door neighbor, quite frankly, and did the cooking. And my uncle, he was the bus boy. He was the one that cleaned off the tables and stuff like that. They had 2 adopted children. I remember that. And then they moved from down there later on, and then moved up to where Mary Masters was, up until they tore it down just a couple of years ago over here in Tontitown. And moved up there. That was also probably in the early 50s or something like that when they moved. But back in my earlier days, I can remember it being down there, because I used to go down there at my granddad's and my uncle's, and work in his garden with him, because the garden was right there by his house, because they raised a lot of the vegetables and stuff that they used in the garden, in the restaurant and stuff like that. Actually, it was an Italian restaurant, and the culture was chicken and spaghetti, and that's what you got. I don't know if there was anything else at that time on the list. I can't think of anything else. Of course, it was always homemade bread, or most of them was some type of roll, homemade rolls. And believe me, it was very popular. People come from all over, off the unbeaten path, and there it was it didn't seat, but probably, my gosh, it couldn't have seated over, because the house wasn't that big. You had 2 rooms that they had tables in, and it might have seated maybe 15 people at the most, or something like that. If it seated, I may be even wrong on that, but it was. But she stayed open, and it was probably open just in the evenings. I can't remember if it was open. It was probably open at 4 o'clock and stayed open till 9 or something like that. Probably what it was for the evening, because that's the way most of your restaurants are done. Now there was other restaurants in town also that went in up here. We call them cafes. And they had your typical plate lunch that you had like that, and they had where the people who run the places baked their own pies and stuff like that, and they had chicken fried steak back then. And you had, and you also could have fried chicken. They'd have fried chicken on the menu, and some of them had steaks and stuff like that. And later on, Mary Master had steaks too when she moved up here, But when she was down there, I don't remember her ever having steaks down there. I mean, it was just chicken spaghetti. That was it. When you went to Mary's, that's all you got. Tontitown was a 4-room schoolhouse with, when I was going to school up there, we only used 3 rooms. We never did use that one room. It was only used just to store stuff. For some reason or other, I don't know if we didn't have enough kids, or if they decided it would take another teacher if you used all 4 rooms, and this way you could get them. And you usually had, 2 or 3 classes to go. When I first went to school there, the grade went through 1 through 9. You went through the 9th grade there. But then I went, I want to say about, after I got about the 3rd or 4th grade, I think they cut it back to just 8, 1 through 8. And that's where I went to school, 1 through 8. I stayed 2 years in the 2nd grade. I had tularemia, and I missed 2 months of school, and so that's why I was held back. Some of my classmates were J.C. Montagani, Philip Piazza, Henry Piazza, Red Mastery. Leslie was his name, but everybody referred to him as Red Mastery. And we had Max Taldo. We had, and in the girls, there was Bernice Artemangi, and there was Luana Barriola, and Ellen Vruki, and that were actually Tontitown girls, as I say, and Tontitown boys. Now, we would have people who would come in and go to school there maybe just 1 year, 2 years, and then move on and stuff like that. And some of these names I don't remember. There was there was 2 young girls that we went to school in the 4th, 5th grade with me. I think they were Youngs with their last name, and I can't remember the first names. Well, we had nuns, of course. We had nuns, and we had one of the nuns was she was a sadist. I mean, that's what I asked my Baptist. Oh yes, you better believe it. I don't believe she should have been teaching. In my estimation, she would not have been, should not have been teaching 1st, 2nd, and 3rd grade, because that's the range we was in. Well, that's it. I mean, you held your hands out like up at the ruler. You've been back like that's right there. You would. I mean, but I mean, you got it for. If you didn't know your spelling lessons, you didn't know still. I mean, you got it for that. But I will say this: of all the nuns that. All the other nuns that we had there, none of them were like that. None whatsoever were like that. The others were all fairly nice. Some of the kids would tell you that there was another nun that I never had. They would have said different, because she'd pop you. I mean, really good. I mean, in the back of the neck and everything like that. You sit up behind you and wham if you were doing something you weren't supposed to be doing like that. No, okay. But I never had her. So all the nuns I had after that were pretty much the same, they were this woman, the one I'm talking about, she was really good friends with my parents. And but that didn't keep her from slapping me with that ruler like everybody else. I mean, that didn't make any difference. Well, after I finished school in Tontitown, my freshman year in high school, I went to Subiaco Academy for 1 year. And Subiaco is a boarding school, and we stayed down there for that 1 year, and it was interesting. Everybody ought to have to go through that one time for 1 year, but 1 year was enough for me. I did not want to go back anymore. I told my dad I'm not going back. I wanted to go to Springdale. So when I came back, I went to school in Springdale. And then after I graduated from Springdale, I went straight from there to a job actually I went to a job in McAlester, Oklahoma, and there were Industrial Tile out of Tulsa, Oklahoma, had hired me to work in a hospital, and that's where I went. We worked there. We would work Monday through Friday, and then come home on the weekends. Is what we would do. Well, you learned how to set tile by you had to work with somebody that knew how to do it, and so you saw how he did it, and they would teach you just like anything else. They would train you, and you were a helper. And once you were a helper, of course, you didn't make near as much money as a tile setter did when you was a helper. But then later on, you could either become an apprentice or you could become a full-fledged tile setter if you wanted to. I was one of the few that got real lucky. I only worked as a helper about 2 years. And I had an opportunity at that time. I was working in, and I went from McAllister to Tulsa, and I was working in Tulsa. And we would go over there on Monday mornings and then come back. We stayed we had an apartment house over there. And we would go over there and stay there during the week, and we'd come home on the weekends. We'd drive on, and we'd drive back Monday morning and stay there during the week and then come back. I think there must have been about 5 or 6 of us that were staying there, maybe even more. I can't remember, different times, because some guys would quit and come back and go back and forth. And we finally give that up and we started staying in a hotel. And that was, and then actually the tile company, Industrial Tile, actually made a small company here in Springdale as a branch company, so that this Stoffe could stay here and didn't have to come to Tulsa and work all the time. So I actually got to stay here quite a bit around here. So I stayed around here more than we did. Then I worked in Tulsa, and later on I had to go to Tulsa. But I went to Tulsa I had an opportunity. A guy said that there had a job going in Wichita, Kansas. If I wanted to go up there and set tile, they would give me a chance to start setting if I would go. And I said, yeah, I'll go. I had just got married. I hadn't been married but about, I want to say 3 or 4 months. And I think I was 20 years old. And so I just said, well, I'm going to go. I went up and talked to the man, and we drove up there one Sunday and talked to him, the owner of the company. And he said, yeah. He said, come on up. I got enough work for you for 2 years. And so I said, and he said, after that, he said, I don't know. But he said, but right now I got enough for 2 years. I said, that's fine. So I said, I'll be here. And I did. I come, and I had rented a home here in Tulsa, and in Springdale, and I'd only lived there for about 3 months. And then I had to turn it back over to it was owned by somebody in Tontitown, quite frankly. And I told him I had to go, and he understood. And I said, I'm going over there. So my wife and I moved up there and lived in an apartment house. And we only stayed there about a year. And the reason we stayed on the year is because the big job never got ready. The smaller jobs, they had a couple of hospitals and a job in Wellington, Kansas that was a pretty good sized job. But the big air base was supposed to be there, and that was the big one. It was running behind by about a year. And I had an opportunity at that time. When I left Tulsa, when I went to and talked to my boss in Tulsa and told him what I was doing, I said, I'm going to leave and go to Wichita. He said, fine. He says, go learn on them and then come back 6 months or any time you want to, and I'll give you a job. So whenever that job up there was slowing down, I actually had an opportunity to come here and work in Fayetteville. They had a ballroom piano was going on. Told me they had about 3 or 4 weeks working if I wanted to come down here and work here. So I came down and worked here, and then they told me they could use me in Tulsa if I wanted to go. So I went up there in Tulsa, and I stayed there for a long time. His name was Ernest Stoffe. Ernest was 20 years old when he come from Italy. He spoke English, but he talked with broken English, of course. And he came here, and he worked in terrazzo and also in tile, and he could do both. And he would get helpers, and he would train these people, is what he'd do. You know, he'd work with them a while, and then those guys would work with a guy, and you just branched out, and that's the way it was. But Stoffe was the one that was instrumental in getting basically all of them. And then he had his buddies. He had like the Cadelli brothers that had in Fort Smith. Why, he knew them real well. They were also Italian, so they had come there, and they'd worked on big jobs when they come here from Italy, because they'd come from Italy too. So they'd come on these government jobs. Most of them were terrazzo and hospitals and stuff like that. There wasn't that many people here in the United States that did this kind of work. This kind of work was the kind of work that had people over in Europe were doing, not necessarily the people here in the United States. And the government was wanting wanting ceramic tile in their operating rooms and stuff like that. And so that's where a lot of this stuff was coming from. And that's, like I said, they had to be able to float it. There was no such a thing as thin set and mastic back then. To be a tile setter to start with, you had to be a plaster. You had to be able to float. That's float walls. You had to be able to do that. To be a terrazzo man, you also had to float floors, because that's how your base floor, you pulled, you had to be, if you could ask, you couldn't be if you were a tile setter, you couldn't be a terrazzo man, but if you were a terrazzo man, you could probably learn to be a tile setter pretty quick, because you learned how to float. And there were, most of your people back then were Europeans that come here. It was the way to earn cash money, because when you worked on the farm, you didn't necessarily always make a lot of money. You just you raised what you ate, and so you always had something to eat. But what families would do, especially large families, they would move into Tontitown, and then they'd go to the coal mines, because that was when people would do it. And they would go over to Krebs, Oklahoma, was one of the places. A lot of it. I've got ancestors, cousins, distant cousins now, of course, but that still live in Krebs, Oklahoma. And in fact, one of my granddad's brother on my dad's side, he went there. He went to the coal mines and he stayed there. So he stayed as a coal miner, where my granddad didn't. He come back and was a farmer, but his brother went over there. After he got a little older, he was able to go to the coal mines, and that was one of the few jobs around that there was for people like that. That was a pretty steady work. Most of the time, the wife and family and kids would stay here, and they would go over and work Friday, Saturday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and probably Saturday. And they might come back Saturday night and go back Monday and work in coal mines. And if they had older kids and stuff like that, especially to milk the cows, they had people to milk the cows and stuff like that, because back then the chickens chickens didn't really come into existence around here until the war, until when the war was, during the war in the 40s. And that's when chickens started. That was when chickens boomed. That's the industry around Northwest Arkansas just boomed. You always had your, I don't know, how would you say it, entrepreneurs and stuff like that in this town. You always had it, and I'm sure that J.C. Montagani would have told you that, the wineries, that one time I think there was 4 wineries in this town. I think there was actually 4. And so one of the wineries was Granada, and Granada had, there must have been a lot of money in wine back then, so they all seemed to do well in it. So I put it like that, because he bought property and stuff in Springdale and stuff like that. He had, like at one time, he owned the Apollo Theater in Springdale and stuff like that. He was just one of the people that you thought that had made it big, people like that. And of course, Richard Artemanga ran the grocery store. He was an entrepreneur. Those were when I was real little, when I was talking about like that. And Tontitown is a town of, it's getting away from that now, but it was a town where almost everybody's related. You get right down to it. It was, you're just related to, you might be a third or fourth cousin, but you're still related to some of these people. And and you take like my mother, she had 7 sisters. She had 6 sisters. There was seven in a family, 7 girls and the 2 boys. And so you have a lot of those. All those sisters married other people, so they've got other names. One of them's a Piazza. One's a, of course, one was a Roso, because I had when I married my uncle. Uncle Joseph, so the sisters married brothers in the Roso family. But then you had, even had one in Tulsa, Oklahoma. One was married to one in Tulsa, and that was Gillis. And His last name was Gillis, and and gosh, I don't know. And Stanberry was one of them. But Ernest Stanberry lived in Fayetteville, and she was married to one of the older sisters. For fun, we would actually. It just depends on what you say as a kid. As a kid, I'll say the very first thing I ever did when I was a kid when we was fun, we used to fish. We fished in all the farm ponds around, and everybody had a farm pond, and they all had fish in them. And so we would fish. Now we would never keep the fish hardly. We'd keep them on a stringer, or make a little pond over a little side and stuff like that, and then knock it out and pull up and go back in and go back the next day and catch them again. That was what it was. And then when we got a little older, when I moved up here, and I was able to ride the bicycle, swimming was the thing. Swimming in the summertime became an everyday event for me, and most of the kids around here, I mean, that lived down here at Brush Creek. We would go down at Brush Creek in the afternoon and swim. We'd ride our bicycles. We'd all get together and we'd ride our bicycles down there and swim and come back. Later on, when we were old enough to drive, I would drive my dad's pickup down there, even though I didn't have driver's license, and because we was always on dirt road, so we would go down and go down to, but we'd always swim. And we would not only come, the kids from Elm Springs would come, and they would be, sometimes there'd be 35 people down in that swimming hole down there, on any given day. Sometimes they'd be, and some would be grown-ups too, not only kids. But the man who owned that place was a real nice gentleman. He was a bachelor, and he took care of us, and he let us have everything in the world that we had wanted. The other people wouldn't even let us on our property. They posted there wouldn't let nobody anything like him. He would not do that. He'd let the kids go in on him and swim on him and stuff like that, and fish on his place and stuff like that. And the other guys, believe me, the other people did not let you do that. They didn't want you on their place. Of course, back then, my parents, for fun, would actually they would visit. You would visit with families. In the summertime was a lot different than you did in the wintertime. In the summertime, you made ice cream. You made ice cream at different people's houses and stuff like that. And you might have maybe at least 4 or 5 different families all coming at one place, and they make 2 or 3 feeders of ice cream, and they just sit around and talk. The grown-ups would talk, kids would play in the dark, and that's about it. I mean, we'd go home at about 11:30, and that would be it for them too. But back then, there was not television. We got our first television when I was 13. And I know that because I came back from Subiaco when we had it. And we were the second family in Tontitown to have a television. And the first family in Tontitown was Johnny Sabatini. He had the first one. He had the first one. He lived right behind me is where he lives. He lives right across there. He's gone now, but his 2 sons still live on the home place. Of course, we always went to church on Sunday. And now, when we went to school, most of the time we went to church every day. We went to church early. We went to church before we went to school. Well, now it wasn't mandatory or anything like that, but most of the time you did. We just went up early, and church didn't last but about 20 minutes or something like that. So we would go, and then we'd go straight from there to school. And but we would have the church part would be there. We would have. Just like I said, we had choir practice and stuff like that we had to go back up to. And then sometime we had church on Sunday night also. What I remember about the Tontitown Grape Festival was, I can remember the first time I went, which was probably, I'm guessing it was probably, I maybe was 5 or 6 years old. And the only thing I can remember being a carnival. It was just a carnival. And it was ran by a lady who lived over on White River. Around here, and everybody in Northwest Arkansas knew her as White River Red. Very prominent lady that everybody in the world knew. And there's even been a book written about her that's in the Springdale Library because I've read the book. And but she had this carnival, and back then it didn't consist of a whole lot of stuff. You had just a very few rides. You always had a Ferris wheel and a merry-go-round. She had those two things, and then little cars that went around in circles for little kids, like I was a little kid, stuff like that. They had that. And then she also had her dice game. They had their gambling games too for the men and stuff like that. They had gambling type stuff too. But I didn't see, there wasn't too much of that. There wasn't very much. And they served, made hamburgers, and they sold hamburgers and pop and ice cream and stuff like that. It was, your town people went. Yeah, well, you got to remember back then there wasn't a whole lot to do. I mean, it was a big event no matter anything like that. People would come from Springdale because there just wasn't nothing. I mean, there wasn't all that much to do back in those days. I mean, that was it. So it was a big event. Now, when they moved it from, and it was right up here where the old store is now. When they built the store where they had that was where the old schoolhouse was at. They tore the old schoolhouse down and built that store. I think that was in -- and then they moved it down where the other school was down there already. The new school was there, but they never tore the old one down, so they always had it up there. Was, I guess, more room for some reason, or what it was, or for something. But anyhow, we had. But then they moved the carnival, and of course we had a lot more room when they added more land down there, and so the carnival got real big. And today, the Grape Festival used to be, in my day and time, was always about 2 or 3 days. When it first started out, I think it was just a one-day affair, but then it progressed until it got to 3 days, and then later on it got to be 5 days because they wanted armband and all that kind of stuff. Oh yeah, I still work the festivals. I still work the festivals. I still sell tickets to the truck and Queens and stuff like that. I still have the tickets there. But when I was younger, I actually worked setting up. I actually worked for the guy who ran the carnival then. His name was Joe Starr when I was in high school. And he would hire us to set it up. He would pay us so much an hour, which wasn't very much. I don't remember now what it was, but it wasn't very much. So much an hour to help them. And we were gophers. We would go get stuff, have to haul it back down there, stuff like that. Because when he started to set up his carnival, they wouldn't all come at the same time. They'd be traveling, and maybe just be 2 or 3 of the things, and he needed to get stuff set up. He wanted to make sure he didn't get caught short-handed out there with no place for people to spend their money, believe me. Another thing that was big at the Grape Festival that you don't hear too much about, they don't have anymore, was the dances. The dances were always in the basement of the school. And I mean, you had everything from country music to the blues. There was a black band that come out of Fayetteville. Gosh darn it, I used to know his name. Buddy Hayes, and he had a blues band, and he had 4 or 5 black guys, and they played the really good the blues music, and people would go pay and you dance, and they had them every night. And believe me, it was hot down in that basement. There was no air conditioning either, girl. I'll tell you what. And it was hot because that basement was low like that. You just had the little windows, you know. They'd open them windows up, but they finally they cut it out because and probably about the time I left here too, it did away with that. Really, when rock and roll come in, that's probably, I remember them have a few rock and roll down there too, so I guess they were still having it then too. But probably mid-50s is probably when it stopped. Baseball games is the one thing in this town. This is one of the things that the grown-ups did do on Sunday, to go watch the baseball game. The town itself, it was the one thing that they always had. I actually played on the baseball teams here, and till I was about till I got maybe 1 or 2 years out of high school, and then I moved off when I went to Tulsa. I didn't play here anymore, but up to that time I did play, and everybody played. And the baseball teams were here people actually they played, and some of them played with their sons. Their sons were old enough to play with them, and they asked his sons. And I know Virgil Vruki, for instance, he played with his two sons, and both of his sons were real good baseball players, and Virgil was still good. Virgil was in his 40s, and he was still playing. Fred Chola was the same way. He had two sons. He was still playing, and they were playing. And some of them didn't. Some of them, had quit. But most of the time, and that's how they kept it going and going and going and going. And the town didn't. And at the Grape Festival that was one of the things that they had during the Grape Festival. They would take in the afternoon of those days. They had a baseball game. They would play whoever there was. It might have been Elm Springs. I don't know who they were doing back then, but back whenever I can remember going, they were playing Prairie Grove, Farmington, and teams like that. They'd get somebody, because people have to take off of work. Remember, most of the people were in these small towns around here were all farmers anyhow, so they'd take off for that to play that. They knew they were going to be playing, so they'd come up and play. And they stopped the baseball probably whenever I was probably about the same time I stopped playing. Because it got to the point they just was having. But at that time, more people were getting jobs out of town. They were going, they had jobs, and so it was costing them money to take time off to play. They weren't just farmers. They had a hard time getting people to play them. We played baseball at night, and we would go. And we didn't have a lighted ball field, but we still played. We would go to Rogers and rent a ball field in Rogers and play. Or go to Siloam Springs and rent Siloam Springs field. They would rent it to us. And then we would play teams from Oklahoma, and we'd meet them over there and play there. But it was big. Baseball was big, and it's sad because I don't think they have a baseball team now. They might have a little league up here going on. I don't know if they do that or not. This case that I have here sitting in my living room is this is what my granddad's dad. That was their belongings. That was their clothes and stuff that they come from Italy. That was the one thing. And it was passed on generation. So he had it. And he wasn't the oldest, but the other one had left here when it was still here. So he had it. And then my dad had it. And then I ended up with it. So I went ahead and kept it. But that was the, and then whenever I go, I doubt if any of my kids want it or anything. If they don't want it, then it'll go to the museum like all the other stuff that goes up there. This is an Italian community, and was always a very close community, and where everybody knew everybody, and also everybody knew everybody's business. I mean, so it was one of those types of. There wasn't nothing went by that didn't know. It's like that, but a lot of people don't know about Tontitown. That there was only, as far as I can remember, 3 families that weren't Italians whenever I grew up in this town. What was considered the town, the town itself, and that was the blacksmith who was still here when I was a kid. I could still remember him. His name was Strebla. He was a German. Him and his wife had moved here, and I don't know what year they came. They came probably in the early 1900s, and because they were up in age whenever I was just a kid, and then a guy by the name of John Klintz and his family, they were also Germans. They came, and both of these families, by the way, were Catholics, so that might have something to do why they did stay here too. But Klintz stayed. In fact, there's a road named after Klintz up there. Klintz Road is in Tontitown. It goes up here. And he had a son. His son was quite a bit older than me. I mean, I didn't remember his son in school or anything like that. He was long older than me. But believe it or not, I worked with his son in Florida. He was my foreman on an Air Force base, not the Air Force base, but Cape Kennedy. When I was down there, it was Cape Canaveral, and then they changed the name to Cape Kennedy when I worked down there. But he was the superintendent, the foreman of the tile company when I was down there. And the third family then was I believe the third one was he must have been from around here all the time. His name was Wilburn, because he lived just south of Tontitown, right on the main road. And I would imagine some of the land that was probably bought around here for the people was bought from him, his family. And I remember he had a son, and I know he had a daughter because I think his daughter went to school with my mother. Yeah, in fact, I know so that there was a daughter, so he had a daughter. And Ern was he was up in age when I was a kid. I can remember, but he was still around. But he had left here and went to the oil fields to work. But he was and he was not Catholic. He was just so he was here always, so all the time. He just lived right there in town. He had got down to then. He might have had 40 acres if he had that much at that time. I tell you, Tontitown was a great town to grow up into. I know off and on some people would tell you that their politics wasn't always the smartest things in the world that they did, because at one time it was true. Nobody in Tontitown would sell you anything. You couldn't buy a piece of land in Tontitown if you wanted to from anybody in Tontitown. They just wouldn't sell it. That's all there was to it. You could go outside of Tontitown and buy land, but you couldn't buy it here. Nobody did. But once it started, as you can see, right here next to my house, they're getting ready to build a ton of houses because people are selling land now. The younger generation is selling the old home places. Is what's happening, and so this is what's happening. But it was just a good place to be brought up in. But there were good people. This is the kind of town that you grew up into that everybody was about on an even keel. You had some people that had a little bit more money than others, but as a general rule, no. Everybody was about the same. I mean, everybody was. I won't say everybody was poor, but I won't say everybody was wealthy either. I'd say everybody was just even keel. In other words, everybody had about the same. Everybody milked the same amount of cows, raised about the same, raised chickens, and had cattle like that. My favorite thing about Tontitown is how I grew up here, and I'll always have those memories. And even though, just like I said, I stayed here till I was 20, and then I moved away. But I did come back, and I knew I'd come back. And I knew that whenever I'd come back, I'd probably never live any place. When I retired, this is where I was going to retire. I know my parents wanted me to stay. Quite frankly, my mother and dad wanted me to stay on the farm. When they sold the farm, my dad, he told me, he says, you're never going to want to farm? I said, no, I do not want to be a farmer. I had figured that out. I learned that at a very young age, that you milked cows 7 days a week, in the morning and at night, and you had to raise chickens 7 days a week, morning and night. And I saw other people out there, they worked 5 days a week, and then they had 2 days off. And I figured that would suit me a lot better than 7 days a week. I still have people here that I know. Now my class are in their 80s, and so these people that are still here, and we still have several just like that. In my 8th grade class, I think there was 9 boys. Now there's 10 boys, I guess 10 boys and 2 girls, because there was 12 of us. There was 3 girls for a long time, but our 8th grade year, one of our girls went to school in Fort Smith, so that cut us down to 2 girls. And I don't know how many's passed away, but over half of them, I think, are still here. So that's still around, and most of them are still here. I mean, there's one lives in Tulsa, just outside of Tulsa. He's still alive. And the rest of them, I guess, are like me. They come back home. Music was one of the things they did for fun around here. Besides having their dances and stuff, they actually a lot of the guys could play instruments. Leo Penalto's family, who had 9 boys and 4 or 5 girls, I don't know for sure how many girls, but all of them could play a musical instrument of some kind. And they would get together with other people at their homes and play. And so I had, at a young age, actually this Stoffi's, this tile setter, his wife is the one, she wanted her 2 kids to learn to play. They had 2 kids and they wanted them to learn to play, and they were my age. And so she got a guy to come in here, was going to come around and give us lessons. And the guy could give you lessons on it. He could play anything. You name it, he could play it. And so he come in and give us 4 or 5 lessons one winter, and that was then it ceased. But it was enough to get some of us going. And so I stuck with it. And I was one of the few that still, of those ones that were taking lessons, that stayed with it. And I got to work. I had played music, and I'd been playing and stuff like that. And I quit playing. Started playing when I was 12. I got a guitar when I was 12. Quit playing when I was about 16, 17. Start chasing girls and going out for dates and stuff like that, and give up playing music. And then I got married when I was 20. And I was in Tulsa, and I just didn't play much anymore. But when I retired, I come back down here, and I said, somebody told me, they said, they're playing music up in the park in Rogers. So I went up to Rogers, and while I was sitting up there, this band walked up there. And up there, they had different groups to just play off up in that Frisco Park. And I looked over and I said, I know some of these guys. These guys are guys that I went to school with. They're playing in a band. So when they got through, I went playing. I went up there to them. My wife and I sat there and listened to them. And I went up there to him and I said, hey, do you remember me? And this old boy looked at me and he said, no. He said, I probably should. And I said, I went to school with you. You was in my class. And I told him who I was. And he said, my gosh, I haven't seen you since the day we graduated. And he asked me, if my wife was here. And I said, yeah. And so he said, you've never met my wife. I want you to meet my wife. And he knew who my wife was because he'd went to school with her too. And so he come over and introduced us like that. And then he was talking about music. And that got me back into playing music. And quite frankly, when I was in Tulsa, when I sold my home in Tulsa, I had 2 guitars over there that had been in my attic. And I hadn't played them so long it wasn't even funny. And I told the lady that bought my house, I said, you have a garage sale, something like that. I said, you can take those guitars and sell them if you want to. And I said, you might get a few bucks out of them if you want to, because I'm going to release some stuff there. And so she kept them. She was going to do them. And I come here, so I had to go buy me a guitar now. I had to go buy me a guitar, start playing again. And I start playing again, and then I decided that I was going to, I was always interested in the fiddle and stuff like that. And so I went to the library one day and picked up out a book of how to make fiddles. And then I come home and I decided, well, I'm going to start making the fiddles. So I made my first fiddle. Different people played it. Said, well, that sounds pretty good. That's neat. And other people. And actually, there was this one guy that he played my first fiddle, and then he played my first, my second, my third fiddle and stuff like that. And he said, he was up in age. He was a good fiddler, real good fiddler. And I don't consider myself a fiddler. I'm a fiddle maker, but not a fiddler. I don't play in public. And he said, I used to make fiddles when I was real young. When I was a teenager, he said, I made some fiddles. He said, I made 5 or 6. And so I got him started making back fiddles. And to this day, I think this man has made about 275 fiddles. I got him back making fiddles. He is making fiddles. His name is Arnold Lang. He lives in Bentonville. And he's 87 years old. And he still plays. I still play with him. And of course, I play guitar whenever I play with these guys. I play the guitar also. So that's where I play with them when I play out. But I played in bands and stuff like that, but I played guitar, not fiddle, when I played in the bands. I'm not a fiddle, but I do make fiddles. And I've got people and I've sold some fiddles. Give a bunch of them away, because I do it for a hobby, basically. And and then I've still got a bunch. The fiddles, it takes me about a month to make one, because I do everything the hard way. And it makes me a month to make one. And to be honest with you, I can make as much money going back to work at my job in a day that I can make off a fiddle. That takes me a month to make. So it's something about fiddle. And Arnold Lang will tell you the same thing. Once you start a fiddle, you want to finish that. You work on it constantly. It's just something about it. It's just different. And I know what he's talking about because that's it. If I can start something and I say, no, I don't want to start one because certain parts of making the fiddle is really hard and litigious, and I don't think I want to do that. But if I ever start, I know I'm going to just take off and do it to finish it up.
What about guitars? You ever make guitars?
No, I never made guitars. I never made mandolins. I played mandolin some a little bit. I played mandolin. It was just the fiddle part was the part that I've always liked. It's just I don't know what it was about it. I've always liked fiddle music. And when I was over in Tulsa, I used to belong to Moose Lodge, and I used to go to dances and stuff over there, but just to listen to the music. But if they didn't have a fiddle in the band, I didn't go. It had to have a fiddle in the band because I've always liked the fin. And I wished I could play, but I can't make this finger work on. That's why I can't play this finger here. And I'm a two-finger fiddler, and there's not much of a demand for a two-finger fiddle.